Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's Fireside Chat with Antoinette and Otti, who have joined us today to share their thinking and their ideas on good organizations. My name is Phil LeNir. I'm president of Coaching Ourselves, and I'm going to be your host for today's webinar, and I'm going to be the MC asking questions of Otti and Antoinette so that they can share their thinking. Today's webinar is recorded, and everybody who's registered will receive a follow-up email with a link to the recording. So if you can't make it or you have to leave early, of course, if you can't make it, you're not here, but if you do have to leave early, you will receive the link to the recording. Finally, Coaching Ourselves is an organization based out of Montreal, Canada, where I am today. And we offer peer learning groups or peer coaching as a way to develop managers and leaders in organizations. If you're interested in learning more about our products and services, please visit us at coachingourselves.com. And everybody is definitely invited to our free public peer group learning sessions with other people around the world to see how our approach works and to meet other people. I'm really happy to have this opportunity to talk with Antoinette and Otti and share their thinking and their journey with all of you. Otti was the first of the two that you see today that I discovered. And Otti, I just want to share with everybody a quick story. So Otti is, or was, Chief Operating Officer of at least half of ING Bank in Europe. And we, during our free sessions, I will never forget having Otti come on late, about 20 minutes late to one of our free sessions, and he was in an airport. Otti seems to always be in an airport, and he was sort of like very innocent and saying, you know, can I join and can I go in, and I'm in the airport and this kind of things. And I was like, yeah, sure, Otti, why don't you go in? And then he did it again in another free session a couple of months later. And that started this discussion between myself and Otti, and I discovered this amazing journey that they're on and these concepts that they're developing and thinking through and they want to share with all of us. So let me start with a recent quote to get you, all of you, in the mood for what we're going to talk about today. So this is Otti writing in a recent LinkedIn post. It's about time we start to realize that unless we bite the epistemological bullet, we will collectively fail if we don't start questioning our mental models and simply restructure our organizations for agility, holacracy, teal, humanocracy, or entrepreneurship. We will fail. We will unwittingly perpetuate an unhealthy course for more productivity, more profits, and still more suffering. Yes, consciousness alone will also not fix it. We need to systematically craft the character of our organizations. And of course, progress will only happen if the leaders and leadership learns to yield positional power and step responsibly into the system. So on that note, I'd ask if Otti and Antoinette could introduce themselves and begin telling us a bit about this journey that they're on. How did it begin?
Maybe, Otti, after that great quote of yours, you are going to start, and then I just chip in a second.
Oh, I just want to say ladies first. But let me start by saying that this quote actually was one of Antoinette's favorite quotes, and it actually comes from interacting with Antoinette. Who was it? Blaine Fowlers, or what? I think Blaine. So the journey we're on is a journey of discovery towards understanding how we can make our businesses good. And when we say good, we mean morally and ethically good in such a way that they contribute to collective flourishing, to sustainable prosperity, to a better world, so to speak. And this is the idea of the epistemological. So epistemology is about what we know and how we know. So in that context, we need to understand whether the kind of mental models that we have, the beliefs and biases that we harbor in the system that we're in, whether they're really useful for us to get towards where we really want to be as humanity. And in this context, our belief is that we cannot separate business from society. Businesses are there as organs of society to serve society. So this idea, this fallacy that we have of separation between economy and society and humanity does not work, right? Businesses are such only by public fire, by societies allowing businesses to incorporate and become something by and on themselves. And we need to do that in a responsible fashion. So coming from different directions. Antoinette from an academic perspective, me from a practitioner's perspective. We kind of found ourselves with similar questions to say in academic or in business institutions, how can we make them better? And I think also, how can we personally as leaders in such institutions play a responsible role? Because it's nice to argue and to beat up the businesses, but kind of we are the business if we're not careful, and we become supporters of such businesses if we don't bite that bullet and not only look at kind of the way the world works, but also how we as individuals, as leaders in the system, have very often been conditioned by the way that the system works, and before we know it, we perpetuate the status quo that the system is in. So I think this was the starting point, and we're talking to lots of intelligent and interesting people to discover what they think, and by the same token, we try to integrate our own knowledge and experience. Antoinette, how would you go further?
Yeah, that was a difficult start because we're already very much in the epistemological space. So I have to try to bring it a little bit back to where I believe I started to come with this, because I think I just felt very bad as a scholar and academic in my 20 years research, because for 20 years I was looking at the topics we are also looking at now, intrinsic motivation, so it's part of flourishing, trust as a very important thing, leaders being able to be vulnerable. We looked at, we know quite a lot about what is kind of not good for intrinsic motivation and trust. So, I mean, we had all the knowledge there, and we run around with the knowledge, or I run around with the knowledge, and I can give you a perfect speech on performance management and slash it with all the evidence there. But it didn't change anything. And I think on the contrary, I would even say with even with agility, some companies have become even worse. And so for me, it's about these suffering machines we have created in the sense that we are almost a little bit back to the factory work of 1910, 1920, but now in the services. So I see a lot of lonely people. I see a lot of burnout. I mean, in Europe, I don't see the same, like Jeff Pfeffer is talking about death by paycheck, but probably, if we are really honest, we have some of these issues as well, because we also have ill-being. And I was a little bit at the end of knowing how to change that. And that is one reason why I teamed up with Otti, because I thought maybe it would be a good idea to team up with a practitioner. So maybe we are just not looking at the right stuff. But the other thing was also that I was also walking around with this mindset. And my mindset was, I always have to show it's good for performance. So I had to show trust is good for performance. Every talk on trust, I start with that. And I just believe that's not the right way to go, because trust in itself is worth as something we really want to have as a good. And I think we need to have a different language. We need to really address ethics as well. So we really need to go down a different path. So I mean, maybe, hopefully, I have given a little bit more color to this very nice intellectual introduction, but of course, I'm not sure.
Well, let me jump in here. So Antoinette, and for everybody who doesn't know, Antoinette is a well-known professor from University of St. Gallen, and I think many people will call her the rebellious professor. And in the professor world, being a rebellious professor can be very difficult. For those who don't know, professors, the whole world of academia can be very narrow. Some people might beat me up for that. But I want to ask Antoinette, why are you the rebellious professor? Or why are you known as the rebellious professor? And why do what's motivating you? What's driving you in that direction?
Well, I mean, I'm in a business school and tell people that performance is not the most important dependent variable. Let's start with that. I'm telling them that I want to take it seriously, that impact is more important than rigorous journal publications. And that is, of course, not good for our rankings. And although I really don't think I am, but of course I'm left. Just because I say the organizations are suffering machines, and because I care about the flourishing of employees. So I mean, 3 reasons to find me rebellious. And of course, I'm also, as you can tell, I talk about this stuff on LinkedIn and everywhere. So another thing you shouldn't do as a professor. So is that enough?
I think that's fine. But I am curious, what gave you the courage? Why? I mean, there's many of us out there working in our organizations, whether it's academia or not. And you know, it takes a lot of courage to sort of put your head up and say, hey, you know, I have a different perspective, opinion.
Well, I'm not even sure that with my personality, I need such a lot of courage, because I am always very outspoken. So I always was. But of course, it has repercussions. You are not in the in crowd, if you want to say it this way. But, you know, as a female professor in a business school with these opinions, you're not in the in crowd anyhow. So I kind of use this as an opportunity, and that probably gives me the courage. And of course, the courage is also there because I really care. I don't want to have this suffering any longer. So I mean, probably these are the reasons from my side.
Excellent. And I just to ask that same question, similar to Otti, what gave you the courage to frankly change your career path? I'd say quite a lot.
I want to add another thing. So because I was trying to frame that that quote I used, but I want to build first on what you said. So I really cherish the fact that we're together here, because there's something which connects all of us. And I think one other thing, Phil, when we found ourselves that we kind of tried to embrace was this ability to create, you said it before this call, community, but also kind of collaboration in a way that connects people who are willing to step into the system that we're in a different fashion. Because as Antoinette said, kind of we often find ourselves quite lonely to a degree, misunderstood maybe, but also not necessarily with all the insights and the tools, right? So I think we're always saying when we were young, we had all the answers. Today, we've got all the questions. And some of these questions have no certain answers. It is in the dialogue that truth emerges, and it might be contingent and change. So the ability to create these networks across individuals and people becomes, I think, almost like a cornerstone of kind of progress, humanity, and management for the next century. And I think that's what Henry is describing in the Rebalancing Society. He ends by saying, of all these movements of individuals and people who want to do good, we need to find a way to connect them. And this is really what we started. And I think even us on this call and the other 44 people, we're creating connections. We're weaving something together, which for me is very important. And that certainly was one of the motivations to step into this space, to say, in ING, there were, of course, a few people who were on the same path, but not so many. And we were all coming at it from a very similar perspective and mindset, simply because we were in the same institution. So actually broadening out towards many other people around the globe, especially during the pandemic, right? I think it was such an opportunity. And then we quickly picked up the value that it had to reach out, connect, integrate, start to have these liminal conversations, like we say, right? Finding people who had the opposite viewpoints and actually saying, well, that's great, right? Kind of, you disagree with me, give me everything that you know and see if we together can come up with something new. But it also is something that is not very, very common, because you talked about academics, right? So being trained as little kind of achievers, right? Who are convincing everybody how brilliant they are by the number of citations or publications or something, right? The same is true for business people. We are trained to win, right? I was trained to win. People came to me every half year with a new requirement as to what leadership was about, right? From being more humble, more visionary, more empathetic, more you know what. But at the same time, as Antoinette said, there was always a request to perform, to over-deliver, right? So I think we were all stuck in these being individuals in our little worlds, and by reaching out, creating community, it was something that felt right. And hence, in terms of, again, courage, I mean, yeah, there's courage, but there's also, if I'm really honest, the fact that I can afford it. Yeah. Right? I know many people with all the courage and all the intellect in the world. And again, sometimes we're in a bubble on these calls, right? Highly intellectual, highly paid, well-educated, and so on. There are lots and lots of people who don't have this opportunity. I'm at a point in my life where I don't need to work, full stop. not because I'm super rich, but because I know how much I can spend, right? So I don't need to go back into work if I don't want to. And that is a privilege that I have worked for a long time, but that I feel very responsible for. And where I feel before I go back into any sort of system, I want to understand how to do this very, very, very well, right? Not being slave of that system, but stepping into a role where I truly believe that I, as a person, together with the people around me, can add value that transcends the type of role, the type of organization that we're in. And it's actually, as Antoinette says, good with a capital G. And that requires a little bit of investigation that during the normal business hours, right, where we just work around the clock and are under so many pressures from day in, day out, it's impossible to do. So if you're really on this journey, you need to make at some stage, you need to make a decision to take the time that it takes. And I think that's where Antoinette and I said, let's go on the sabbatical together, because that's the other thing. You cannot do it by yourself. I mean, I can't. Maybe there's some people here who in the ivory tower can figure out how the world works. I can't. You need to create dialogic spaces where people together hold these important questions and try to find answers together. So long answer to this, right? But this is kind of the sentiment. And I love your coaching ourselves idea, right? Because again, it's exactly that same sentiment. It's bringing people together to lift each other up. And frankly, the world had enough of these narcissists who just go about kind of making themselves better and bigger, right? 99% economy, what in the United States, 8 people have 80% of the assets. You must be, pardon me, fucking kidding, right? What system are we creating if that is the outcome? We'd better start looking around. And yeah, I'm with Greta.
Excellent, thank you.
And now
so, but that
out of business school after that statement, because they say you're working with that guy. That's not possible here.
So, but let me use that as a little segue to ask Antoinette. Let's start with the motivation for all of this. Give us a bit of the lay of the land. You say work has become a global health hazard. Can you explain why you say that to everybody listening?
Well, I probably did say a lot about that already, but I mean, we can see with all the figures that we have more illnesses, more burnout, more, even to a degree, people which are at the verge and maybe not yet showing unethical behavior, but game the system. We can show that trust is really evaporating, certainly trust in leadership, trust in organizations. And that is amazing, isn't it? Because we had these initiatives for, I think, even 50 years when we looked it up, not only about new work, but also humanization of the workplace, good work, another good work. So we tried and tried and tried, and obviously things got worse rather than better. And I mean, this is of course where we started to ask ourselves, how can that possibly be? I mean, there are all these initiatives, so what's wrong? And that's where we come from. That's where we say, yeah, suffering machines again. And of course, how you just summarized it.
And could you tell me, there was another quote that I read from both of you. We are hostages to our own worldview. What do you mean by that? And how does that relate to all of this? Antoinette or Otti?
Going on the worldview, and then because Antoinette knows that's one of my hot topics. I think there's so what is philosophy, right? Philosophy, as Plato suggested, is a sense of wonder. Right, it's the ability to hold reality's object and look at it and say, oh, what is it? What do I know and why? What is the reality and why? So there's kind of a means and kind of we are on the journey to acquire the skills to go there and actually look at the way that we make sense of the world. But there's a way that we as individuals make sense of the world that we're in. What we hold as truth, right? Whether we only hold as truth what's in our bank account, what is measurable, what is quantitative, or as Antoinette says, whether kind of soft things like relations, whether that is part of the way that we make sense that is important for us, and how we go about changing things. So what are the patterns that we have, right? Is it deterministic? So is it linear thinking, right? So I tell you what to do and then that will happen. Is it system thinking where things become entangled and complex? So there are all sorts of assumptions as to how we go about doing what we're doing, right? And these mindsets, these paradigms are very important, because if we are not able to go on the balcony with ourselves, so self-observe of the pattern that we create as individuals, but also the patterns that we create as organizations, very often we are doomed to just repeat things. We might, as Antoinette says, we might call it agile rather than TQM, rather than quality circles, rather than whatever methodology you might come up with, but it might in reality be still the same. The emperor still has no clothes, because we're just perpetuating the same underlying beliefs about the value of human life, right? The value of relationships, whether prices are good indicators for what is worthwhile investing our time in, and so on, right? So the underlying belief sets that we have. And if we are, so the notion of being imprisoned is in that leftist way that Antoinette says, so believing that in capitalism we have some beliefs, right? Competition is good, prices are value, private property is all that matters, right? So these are some of the typical beliefs of a capitalistic system. And whilst kind of people are now accusing us to be socialist, right, where that would require proper definition, I think we are not entirely sure what we are for, but we're certainly against some of the underlying assumptions in the current kind of dominant paradigm that we are living in, because it creates that suffering that Antoinette talks about. If I, as an organization, pursue competition or pursue profit or pursue dominating, controlling positional power in a hierarchical structure without investigating why I'm doing it and what it says about me as an organization, as an individual, as a person, what I believe in, what I care about, that is a very bad starting point for true transformational change. That's how I would go about it. Antoinette, how would you do it?
No, I just wanted to maybe bring two examples of Phil. It's going to be difficult with us too. I already see that.
Don't worry, guys. It's all good. It's just us here.
Make it a little bit more concrete, because I think we also have a number of HR professionals in the call. First of all, competition, indeed. And I found that really striking. We just all believe it's inspiring, but nobody ever tested it. So we tested it. Is it really creating inspiration inside companies? I mean, we create a lot of competition by rankings, by exclusive talent management, and so on and so forth. And guess what? We didn't find any inspiration. We found envy, and we found knowledge hiding. So, I mean, okay, here I went about it in an empirical fashion, but it's just an assumption we had. We never even tested it. So that to me is a very typical one. And I think it was even done in good spirit, because often you introduce these type of rankings because you believe, well, I help my managers that they find it easier to also sometimes have difficult conversations. So I'm just putting it in a very nice fashion now. I could put it differently as well. I think the second point is also very interesting. If we go to agile, just let me give me one example, and I think Otti is not exactly the same opinion. So one of my favorite example is OKRs, the new way to define goals. And whilst we need goals, I think OKRs also have a number of problems. First of all, if they're usually very quick, so you have every quarter new OKRs. Then they're sometimes used on the individual level, which is not really the idea. On the individual level and in an overambitious fashion, because that's part of the OKRs, give people overambitious goals, quick, fast goals, it's also called. Now, we can show if you do that you just up a lot of pressure on people, that you get emotional depletion, and that is often leading again to gaming and unethical behaviors. Again, that's just descriptive, but we are using, I think it could be a good tool, but we're using it in the same way as before. We're using it more as a control mechanism, as a I want people to do something mechanism. And then, of course, if we're using it with the wrong mindset, we produce the same as we produced before, suffering.
Thanks. Let me use that for our next segment, if you wish. So we've discussed the motivation, with the lay of the land, what's going on in our world, and to a certain degree, we're locked in this jail of our own mindsets, if you wish. So what is, Otti, Antoinette, what is this idea of a good organization? And again, I've taken a little sort of sentence that I've seen in the writings that you've done, and there's this sentence that's sort of, why are we really here? What's our purpose, and what's the purpose of organizations? In other words, what is a good organization? Who wants to start?
Do you want to go first? I think my internet is crashing.
Antoinette, what is a good organization?
Well, first of all, before we go into the proper definition, we came from suffering. Now, of course, we want to have the opposite of suffering. We want to have thriving, flourishing, not only of the organization, but as we will say in a second, also of society. So being also a contributor to the aliveness, the thriving of society. So that's a very easy way to put it. But of course, we had in mind virtue ethics. And I don't know whether we first need to talk a little bit more about virtue ethics before I give you the exact way how we then picture how this aliveness creating organizations would have to look like, and why we call them good organizations. And here I give it to Otti because he loves to talk about Aristotle, and I'm sure he can put it in a very nice way.
So for everybody, and I've heard this before, Otti's going to talk to us about this ethics. It's very important that we get this base idea of ethics, and then Antoinette will build upon that for the organizations. Go for it, Otti.
Absolutely. Come with me on a journey. 2,500 years ago, Lyceum, Athens. But before I go there, to Aristotle roaming in his cloister garden, so to speak, I think there is indeed a need to talk about ethics. And I want to just make it simple, so to speak. So the challenge we found, and again, for us, this was new territory to a degree, right? Because sadly, I've been a leader in organizations for 25 years, and my ethical training was mostly compliance training and not really about what does it mean to behave well. So two definitions for everybody who is interested. Firstly, moral philosophy. Moral philosophy is about what is good and bad, what is right and wrong, right? Ethics is about how to put that into practice. Right, so once you know what good is, then what are the ways to act in a morally good way? That is ethics, right? At least in the simplistic definition that I'm using here. In a nutshell, we can see we can expand to 4 or 5, but for the purpose of this call, 3 grand theories of ethics: utilitarianism, deontology, and virtue ethics, as Antoinette says. Right, these are the most famous ones. So utilitarianism, famously coming from Adam Smith, right? So it's about utility. What is good? So ethics, acting well. What does it mean in utilitarianism or capitalism, if you want? Well, it's very simple. If the net utility of what you do is good, then you should pursue a specific action, right? So net utility is good. So just think about this, right? So that means if you hear about net zero, net positive, Paul Polman's new book, and so on, that is all the utilitarian basic idea. It's like a business case, right? So if the positive is better than the negative, then you should pursue it. In reality, the idea was for all stakeholders, or the majority of the stakeholders. What's the problem with utilitarianism? Well, of course, it is one, we very often forgot or forget lots of the stakeholders, right? So we say, kind of, let's do this because the business case is good, but we haven't included the environment, the employees, the general society, the future generations. None of these people are in the business case. And then we just do what is good for us, right? So profit, what is good for the shareholder becomes the law. Secondly, again, this notion, and Greta Thunberg interestingly pointed this out after COP26, right? So this net zero idea is you can do bad as long as you do a little more good, right? So the net positive, the net zero works. And that is, of course, completely wrong, right? If something is making the planet suffer, to Antoinette's point, you should stop it now, right? There should be no balancing off or trading off or net whatever. No, if you're doing bad, stop it, right? But in utilitarianism, that isn't the logic. Deontology is about rules, right? So it's Kantian logic. It's about rational rules. So if you follow the rules, what you do is good. If your parents tell you to be home at 12, if you're home at 12, that's good. If your boss tells you to do X, right, and hopefully that is rational, then if you do that, you're on the good track. Virtue ethics is different. Virtue ethics is, so here Aristotle, right, he was asking, why are we acting? What's the purpose of life? And his idea is that the purpose of life is a good life, a life where we come to the end of it and say, wow, that was good. And we say that from Aristotle, interestingly enough, uses the word good and beautiful as one word. It's a life that is beautiful because it has something that makes our eyes sparkle, something that is good, so to speak, just because it is enacting that potential of humanity, that flourishing that is intrinsic to the human race, right? Something that is truly good. And we're doing that by cultivating moral character, virtues throughout our lives, right? So it's not something that is an outcome, it's something that gets enacted in the moment. Every single moment we decide what to say, how to act, and if we do that in a good way, in a virtuous fashion, that is good. After Mike is saying, after virtue by McIntyre, exactly. And what McIntyre is decrying is this relativism that we have fallen into in our postmodern society, right? Where we're saying there is no good and bad. Everything is true. Well, yeah, guess what? If you go into the living room and kill your mother, that's not good, right? Not everything is good just because someone has an opinion. And we somehow, as a society, and this is a famous theorem, the impossibility theorem by Freeman, we need to agree on certain things as a society in order to come together and enact that. And our belief is ethics gives us a way to do so. So pursuing a good life for all might be a good enough logic to make decisions together, where it's what the good life is for you vis-a-vis for me allows still for a lot of contingency as to different people having different ways to lead their lives. But there's something that brings us all together. And the test is whether if what we do makes us proud as humans, makes our eyes sparkle as human beings, is a better and a flourishing life for all. And this is the kind of notion, right? And here I think morality is undervalued. In business schools, we talk about cost of compliance or risk of reputation. That's not what morality was about. Morality was about why the hell are we here? Who are we? What makes our eyes sparkle? Who do we want to become? Ethics is about deciding what future we want, right? It's not about the future of work, right? Where the work is somehow being curtailed by automation and AI. No, it's about what is the work of the future? Who do we want to become through our organizations and our work? What is the vision of ourselves that is embedded in the way we act and interact with each other and with the world? And that's a little bit the spirit. I'm not sure I'm getting there, but it's kind of, this is the spirit that we want to bring back. And then we've appropriately called this new rule and governance for organizations eudemocracy, because this good life in Aristotelian speak what was called eudaimonia. Eudaimonia in Greek means the way of the good demon, the way of your guardian angel that makes you do the right thing, the good thing in the moment. And we want to bring organizations back into this eudemocracy, right, to step into roles where they enable collective flourishing. And here I give it back to you all, Antoinette. I hope I've done.
Thank you so much, Otti. It was brilliant. Please, Antoinette, build on that. Organizations. Yeah, what's a virtuous organization?
Well, already said amen, and I think that's he got carried away. Sometimes we also look at Catholic social teaching, so maybe that was the background. No. I just wanted to, if I would have to bring that now to the organizational, more practical view, I would say what organizations are all about is to bring that sparkle into our lives again. And that means, of course, the aliveness of the people who work in this organization, but also of the ecosystem. So we already discussed that probably means that we also want to be good citizens. And that is also how we look at organizations. We call them mini societies. So they're part of society. And they also have to always look whether they're also contributing to the aliveness of the society, because after all, for Aristotle, it's, and I think we already have touched that, it's always the me in the community. So the community is in the end the important aspect here. And this is where the organizations in general should be heading to. Now I try not to be preachy, but I try to make that a little bit more concrete, because that is the eudemocracy that Otti was already talking about. In a little bit more practical terms, maybe you don't find that practical, It means that we are having to think about the organizational character as a moral character. And here we believe it's very important that we are creating a zone of aliveness which is very much infused by care as well. And I just pronounce care. We have other aspects because I think this is what we are worst at present. Because care means, it may be more a feminine quality. It means to also feel that we are related. It means to care for the other. It maybe even sometimes means love. This is something we always a little bit fight about, whether love is the right terminology or not. And this type of virtues, which are about caring, about fairness, about trust, need to be imbued in the fabric of the organization. For instance, by the routines we are living in this organization, by processes, maybe even by HR instruments. So in the end, we might even get there. So the first thing is the moral character of the organization, how to build that up. I think you would call that in practice legacy, but it's a little bit more defined, I think, the way we see it. And then I think another important thing is that you are then trying to enable also the normal bits of the organization. So the structure, for instance, of the organization also needs to enable both individual and collective flourishing. So you would then go into the normal aspects of organizing and try to bring that together with this more agentic individual flourishing bit and the organizational flourishing bit. And thirdly, but I think this is something that we're later going to talk anyhow about, you also need some wisdom in the organization. So I think that's wisdom can mean a lot of things. What we mean with that is we believe there are a lot of decisions in the organizations which are morally infused and we often don't see it. So collective wisdom is about pausing, about seeing and reflecting that there could be questions. Are we still upholding aliveness? Are there different maybe challenges because there are different groups with different points and different interests? So are we creating reflective spaces in all that running of an agile and complex world where we deliberate, often also together, whether we are still on the right track and whether we are holding the system where it should be developing towards. So I hope I wasn't too abstract now. I tried to be concrete and maybe I wasn't as abstract.
Let me see if I can ground this a little bit for all of you. So, you know, all of this sounds great, huh? And I'm going to play the devil's advocate here. This all sounds brilliant and it's all nice and it's lots of interesting words to describe this sort of universe of organizations that my personal lived experience doesn't match. When I was 30 and I was, you know, a new manager in an engineering organization, when I discovered like this fail fast culture, I thought it was the most amazing thing in the world, right? It made sense. Let's just try a lot and fail. Let's have competition and then people will strive harder. And, you know, the idea of going into the organization after a couple of years and having a sparkle in my eyes, I had none of that, right? I was going into the organization and I was turning that sparkle off so that I could go through my day and all this kind of stuff. So how does any of this actually happen? I mean, you know, this seems very wonderful in the abstract, but in the reality, how do we do this? And this will tie into the question of leadership and how do we, you know, craft leaders and organizations that I believe can help turn this wonderful vision into a reality for more and more of us.
Can I make a point on this? I love Christiane's point on the chat, right? So this question, and Antoinette pointed to this earlier, right? In academia, when something's published about trust, the necessity to always somehow qualify it on how it makes higher performance. And frankly, if you read, so Antoinette and I looked at, I don't know how many business ethics handbooks, right? So then, and I would say 80% of them frame business ethics in a teleological, in a cause-effect relationship to organizational profit. So the question becomes, how can ethics help me, or how do I mitigate the risks in the ethical space so that the organization becomes profitable? And of course, as Christiane points out, that's a joke, right? That's a bloody joke, because the point is that ethics is there to qualify what the objectives, the success measures, the understanding, the identity of the organization should be in the first place. Right? So you cannot make ethics like something that helps you to deliver your current version of reality and of value. You need to use ethic to qualify whether that version of vision or version of value is correct, right? And here I think Christiana's point is that's kind of all nice, but we still get asked this question. And I don't know what the answer is, because again, the challenge I found, and I'll let Antoinette speak to this, because another shorthand for our inquiry was like this midlife crisis project, right? Because we also somehow felt that we were crashing into walls with some of this, right? What I found is there's only one place that you can activate to change yourself or other, which is, as Antoinette says, kind of, it's your heart. Right? If you are not willing to change, I cannot make you change. Right? I don't know if you've ever tried to change someone, right? Your peers, your parents, or whoever it might be. Every single time I failed, right? There has to be a predisposition to go on that journey. Right? Like in the Steve Campbell's hero's journey. You need to understand when the call for adventure is there and is right for you to take. And this in the guy, and so to the question on the chat, right? So if I go back to the CEO and say, listen, kind of, you want me to fire 500 people to make more profit, and I'm telling you profit is not what we should aim for, and the CEO comes back and says, yeah, that's all nice, Otti, but I still want you to fire 500 people. You guess what? And this is where Alan's question becomes very important, right? How can we get people to a point where they can afford it? You have to draw the line somewhere. So if the CEO insists, and the CEO in an organizational system has such a prevalent influence and position, then you have to go. That's my philosophy, right? So you will not be able, in a hierarchical system that is based on positional power and dominance, if the CEO is not on your same pathway, or at least willing to listen, forget it, right? So then you get into a deontic logic and relationship where the rule is the rule. So either you kind of abide by the rules that the organizational system is creating, or you go, right? You don't have voice, you only have exit. And frankly, if you look at what is today happening with this YOLO movement, the you only live once movement, I think a lot of people are choosing exit, because the lack of aliveness, as Antoinette says, the lack of humanity, the lack of understanding for what actually matters in life has come to a point where even people who cannot really afford it are saying, I'm not going to do this anymore. And this is similar to what we saw in the Italian Renaissance in the 16th century, after the plague, right, where people were threatened in their lives. They wanted to go back to feeling alive and being alive, and they were not willing kind of to go back to the dark ages anymore. And maybe that's what we are hoping for, and I see some of this, right? But then again, so to Antoinette's point, how can you move on that journey? If what we currently suggest is true, the first thing is purpose. So if people don't embrace a wider purpose than profit, I guess you have to go. Right? You can try for a while to get them to convince, but if they're not convinced, in a hierarchical system, at least you're stuck, right? But if they're willing to listen, then what can you do? Well, again, these components that Antoinette looked at. Firstly, is structure, right? So we experimented with sociocracy and looking at different ways to unleash both autonomy and solidarity, right? So how can you create new forms that don't destroy individual flourishing, but also create community and collective uplifting and co-elevation, right? Then this character building, and especially the kindness point that Antoinette made, and this question on wisdom, to make sure you constantly reflect and get better, both morally and in terms of what you've promised to your stakeholders. What does that mean for leadership, which was your question? Well, leaders need to enable that, right? So firstly, they need to role model and practice these virtues and wisdom and the character that we want to see in the organizations themselves. But I think that is not sufficient, right? So we've talked about how Merkel and the president of New Zealand and whatever, kind of female, feminine leadership is great. Yeah, that is nicer, but if you're not careful, that's lipstick on a pig, right? This never was a gender question, it's a maturity question. And that implies integrating animus and anima, as Jung would suggest, right? It's both feminine and masculine. We need paternal and maternal framing in organizational systems to enable development, right? So let's not make our lives too easy. So leaders need to do the right thing to start with, but then I think they need to go through this transformation journey to actually, as we said at the beginning, question their own purpose, their own epistemologies. Who are they? Who do they want to become? And through their becoming, what do they want to enable their organizations to become? And in our current thinking, and again, it's all draft, we believe that roles play a big role. Sorry for the pun. Right, so traditional leadership role is a command and controller. We went to a degree to leadership roles, and the HR people on the call would realize that, like the therapist and the coach, right? So leaders become coaches. Antoinette and I believe we need to move to a leadership role which is a guardian of the system, a trustee of the institution. And the institution as organization, but organization embedded in the wider society. So leaders need to evolve their own thinking, consciousness, and character. But at some stage, they need to commit to becoming servants of the system with the skills, the ability, the consciousness, and the will to enact that systemic logic of collective flourishing. And that is not easy. Right? So we're now looking at how can we do that. And our latest idea is to make leadership a profession, where we actually create a leadership society whereby leaders, so everybody in an organization who has a leadership role would need to become a member of the leadership society, and at the same time has a role, a temporary role in an organization, so that whatever they do, they always have to abide by the requirements of their job, their role in the organization, but also the ethos, the responsibility, and the best practices of the leadership as a profession. And you could almost envisage a leader to swear a Hippocratic oath like a doctor or like a lawyer, because as Antoinette will tell you, leaders can make or break people and organizations. So it's only, I think it's only appropriate that these people need to have obedience, so to speak, or a responsibility that goes beyond the organization that they're in.
So allow me, and this would be to Antoinette, to frame this for many of the people that we work with and on this call are in learning and development or leadership development in organizations. And they, like most people in organizations today, are facing this challenge of the great resignation or whatever we call it, right? And then we see lots of questions. What am I going to do? Oh my gosh, you know, I'm having trouble retaining people. It's impossible to get new people. And you're in charge of leadership development. So what message do you have for these people in terms of, you know, how they could see their role differently, or how they could go about trying to change things up so that they can help their organization and their stakeholders that are asking them to try to do something about this great resignation, but within the framework within which they exist? In other words, you're an L&D professional in a large organization. Antoinette.
Well, I mean, I'm the HR person, not the leadership person, but I don't find that overly difficult. And now I'm saying great words, of course. But first of all, I wouldn't waste money on all these silly leadership programs out there without even having the evidence that they ever affect anything. So if you want to do something, then it's probably much better what you're doing here. So take this really as a vertical development, as a personality development aspect. I think that's one thing. The second thing is make the life of leaders not more difficult. So because we often throw very stupid practices at these leaders and make it very difficult for them to be good leaders by these practices. I have already put some of them into the talks. I mean, if it was up to me, I would kick out the whole performance evaluation stupidity, because in reality, we often cannot even measure performance. We have enough data for that to raise big questions, other than with blue collar, very simple type of jobs where you probably don't really have to measure so much anyhow. And that is already also difficult for people. And then maybe just make sure that you have a not only the language, but also a better atmosphere. Think about emotions again. I come back to the emotions. I do believe it's so important, and we have so many findings there, that people learn to open up. And if it's just small, I mean, you all know the gratitude exercises. This is small. I think everybody can do something like that, but maybe we can dare a little bit more. Maybe we can start with a signature practice, our meetings. Maybe we can laugh together more. Maybe we can really inquire more how people feel. And I think once you get more into this area, it makes leadership development also easier. I mean, I talked to Otti, and we had some of these very interesting interviews, for instance, with Bill Torbett, and it takes ages, in my opinion, to come to this high degree of consciousness, and it's very hard, and you need crises and everything. And I can see that it is an important journey to go on. But in the meantime, help them a little bit and create the emotional fabric, which is helpful in this regard. That's what I would say. But probably Otti is not quite satisfied and would want to make another point into the leadership direction.
I would love to build 2 points onto it. And one, what Alan said on the chat, right? And what we said with leadership as a profession. I think to our HR colleagues, I think leadership development has traditionally failed in 2 regards. One, it has completely underdeveloped vertical leadership. So the evolution of consciousness, again, this epistemological bullet, the ability to go onto the balcony with myself, not only to distance myself from my thoughts and feelings, but also my relationships and my worldviews. That capacity for consciousness is critical. And I have done, as I said in the Bosch talk that I recently did, probably 150 or so development journeys or trainings of any kind. And the vertical development was almost completely absent. And by the way, it's also not coaching. A lot of the coaching is performance coaching, which completely underestimates this notion of vertical development. That's the first thing. And then to Alan's point on the chat, the second is we have and again, people mention POS on the chat. There is this obsession with individualistic development. The fact is, if you look at Yalom and psychotherapy, very often adults develop in solidarity groups, like what Phil is doing with Coaching Ourselves. Adults develop together. There's a process called consensual validation, where if I am with peers and peers allow themselves to progress, then I take permission to follow them and do the same. Because I respect them, I see myself in them, and through this collective elevation, co-elevation, lifting each other up, that's where true progress very often in ego identity development or moral development happens. So we need to create groups of people lifting each other up. Let's forget about this kind of executive lead coaching for the one leader. No, that's not how it works. That's also not how we want the leaders to step into the system. We want leaders to become creators, crafters of community, of ecosystems, which means they need to have boundary spanning capacities. They need to constantly think in connections, right? So how can I connect Antoinette and Phil, and then I take myself out. I don't dominate that relationship. I don't make myself the calibrator or the intermediator. I weave connections all the time, right? These type of capacities. So vertical development, consciousness, group settings or co-elevation settings. And then thirdly, to Antoinette's point earlier about virtues, right? I want to make this point here because, I mean, some of this vocabulary, I mean, had you come to me a year ago, I would have probably looked at you with big eyes and said, who are you, a Catholic priest or what, right? It's a kind of virtues, morality, character. It's absurd. But I think we're probably also getting too close to it. But I mean, there are 2,500 years of clever people thinking about what a good life looks like. And we shouldn't just throw it away, because after the Enlightenment, we actually became disenlightened because we put our faith purely into science rather than anything else. And science is descriptive. Philosophy is normative. Science cannot answer the question of what we should do in our lives. It just can't. That's not what it's there to do. That is philosophy. So we better become a little bit philosophers of our lives and our organizations again, right? So I think this, we need to reacquire this capacity of looking at what we're doing and see how we can take a step in the system that lifts the system up. And there was one more point that I wanted to make. So vertical development, creating the space for individuals to develop together, and virtues. So Antoinette talked about virtues and this rather bizarre language around it. I want to make just one point, and to make it simple again. Virtues are not values. Values is what you've got on PowerPoints, on brochures, on posters in your cafeteria. And values is what lots of people normally ignore, right? Many people care about it, but many people also just use it as greenwashing or window dressing or whatever, right? The difference between a value and a virtue is something that is enacted in the moment, in an action. I become virtuous through doing. I cannot put a virtue on a slide, so to speak, right? I become virtuous by acting with kindness, as Antoinette says, or by acting with courage or humility or something like that. And these virtues are useful because they allow me to grow as a person, step into the roles, Phil, to your point, right? The virtue of humility allows me to not take myself too seriously and start to look into how I'm functioning. The virtue of vulnerability allows me to step into the space with someone else and become actually listening to that person and co-elevating, right? And the virtue of global caring, that's why Antoinette puts so much emphasis on caring, allows me to take care not only of my family, not only of my team, but of the organization, of the society, of the world, right? So I'm enlarging my capacity for caring across these different interconnected systems that I'm in. And that's the kind of capacity that we need to reactivate, because somehow we've become dumb in this post-modern world. And we have lost God, Schumacher suggested, and we haven't found anything to replace it with, right? We have put our faith in science, but then we found out science is not answering these questions. And we've just closed our ears and said, okay, I don't want to listen to that anymore. I am my bank account. I am what I have. I'm good by myself, and then don't step onto my space, negative freedom. And that's just not good enough for a 21st century society.
Amazing. Thank you, Otti. So look, everybody, we're a couple of minutes away from the top of the hour, and officially we're supposed to end at the top of the hour, but I'm going to ask Antoinette, Otti, do you have an extra 10 minutes or so with us? Because I'm sure there'll be some questions. Is that good for both of you?
Of course.
Excellent. So Otti, I'm assuming it's good. So look, people, if you have some questions, you've already been answering questions and talking in the chat, just try to put 2 or 3 more questions if you have anything specific, and we'll get to them with Otti and Antoinette. But just before you answer those questions, both Otti and Antoinette, I'd like to ask you one more question. So both of you, in your careers, maybe a year or 2 years ago, you started on this journey, right? You know, Antoinette decided that it was no longer going to be how many papers can I write and how many references can I get. I'm going to do what I believe in. And Otti decided, you know, no, I'm not going to continue along this sort of corporate career path that my parents think I should go on or society thinks I should go on. I'm going on this other one. Has it been a good journey for both of you? Has it been worth it? And can you talk to those of us on the call that are maybe thinking about starting that same journey ourselves today? What do you have to say to them?
Well, I feel very privileged to be able to be on that journey. I have to say it really created, or it brought my aliveness back. And I mean, I have a dream job. That's what they say, at least. But it was a little bit like Otti was saying. So I was also reading this book, Tribal Leadership, and I felt as lonely as that guy who was sitting on the top of everything and wasn't able, because the curiosity of my fellow researchers wasn't there any longer. We didn't have the exchanges, we didn't have the community. And now being able to open up again, and also, of course, all the challenges, because it's not always easy to work together, I have to say, because sometimes I don't understand what Otti is saying, and probably it's the other way around. But I mean, it's just kind of, it makes you feel that you're on the right track, that you awaken again, if I can put it this way, and hopefully, because we haven't really started to try to go out and build a community, we can bring a lot of people onto that journey who want to exchange with us, who want to quiz us, who want to bring in new ideas. I mean, this is what this is all about, at least for me.
Otti?
I mean, so for me, the question is almost nonsensical. And I explain why, right? I love this. There's a book by, I think, James, it's going to come back to me, a Jungian psychologist who's written finding meaning in the second half of life. And subtitle is, and finally growing up. And I think this is what I meant by it is about adult maturity, right? This is about us. We only have one life, right? And whether we try to avoid, and I've seen our friend Simon Weston on the call, right? And Simon always talks about, in his depth analysis, talks about what is your desire, right? Stepping into this space of understanding ourselves, understanding that our lives are finite, which also, by the way, gives our lives meaning. If our lives were endless, there would be no meaning. The fact that it is precious is what gives it meaning, but we need to make good of that, right? We need to create that meaning for ourselves. And if we don't do us, as Socrates suggested, kind of an unexamined life is not worth living, right? We need to go through this journey as a part of our becoming adults. Sadly, if you look at all the statistics, only 2 to 3% of the population seem to ever go into this space. But I guess once the doors open, you have no choice. You have to go through it. I don't feel I have a choice because the question has been asked I now have to answer it.
Interesting.
Right, and I think that maybe the final point on this, one thing that it opened up was new friendships. And that is, again, to Antoinette's point, that the notion of virtuous friendship, again, it's a friendship that is not just the bar conversation. It's people that lift each other up, that challenge each other because they care, that are willing to invest in the other person because the other person is valuable, so to speak, right? These type of friendships and communities have value in themselves. And I think what we have found by throwing the door open and asking these loud questions, we've actually attracted a few people who are willing to go into that same space. And it's been very beautiful to spend time with these people and to really kind of explore this. I think the challenge is that it should not, and again, I'm looking at Simon virtually on the call here. We need to make sure that, and you, Phil, you yourself with your Coaching Ourselves, we need to make sure it's not just a self-serving, endless meditation, writing haiku rhymes, looking out of the window type of exercise, because that very quickly becomes narcissistic. It has to be a courageous, exploring myself to step into the world and make a difference type of thing. So we're on a journey to maybe write a book about this, as someone suggested on the chat. But above all, we want to hold the dialogue. We want to grow through this and then step more responsibly into our lives and into work. And ideally as a collective, not as an individual, right? And here, I think Simon is asking a question on the Q&A, right? See, he says, striving for the collective good is not new. Philosophers aim for this, political movements aim for this, religious movement, everybody's aiming for this. Shouldn't we stop trying to change organizations internally and rather try to change what organizations are, what they're for? My question is, my thinking is similar, right? I think with Graham Boyd, our good friend who's written the book Rebuild, who's was mentioned on the call, Graham is looking at new forms of organizations. We're talking to lots of people who are investigating into new legal forms and structures, right? And that could become part of the solution. Because if an organization is there for shareholders and just running after quarterly profits, that might create such a strong corset that they will never evolve beyond that narrow short-sightedness that they're kind of imprisoned in. But I think, frankly, even if we had different organizations, and don't fool yourself, lots of agile organizations become toxic, right? Because you need order, as Simon calls it, containment. You need order and freedom to develop, not just the one or the other. And you don't want to just have individual flourishing, you want collective flourishing. So we need what Henry Mintzberg, kind of your great patron, Phil, calls a declaration of interdependence. We need to step interdependently into the space. And that is something we need to nurture. It's a question of individual agency, but it's also a question of institutional structures. And it's also a question of education and beliefs. And here again, my final point is there's a difference between consciousness and this tear movement and people who just meditate and so on, and faith. Consciousness is something you can do in your minds, right? You can just go into a cave and become ever more conscious or so. Faith is different. Faith is, and I don't mean religious faith. I mean faith in whatever you believe in, right? Faith pulls you into the vulnerability to put yourself out there and step into a role that changes the interactions, the relationships, and therefore the world that you're in and the way you see the world. So there's a difference between spirituality and faith. And again, I don't mean religious faith, right? I'm agnostic, but I think there's something in this notion of faith, which is more vulnerable and is something that is needed of every person to step into the faith of interdependence to make this world better. And I think that is something we need to nurture, and that transcends probably the idea that organizations have a different legal form also.
Yeah, and I just want to kind of follow that up with very shortly, because that is just so nice. In trust research, we talk about the leap of faith, and I think this is exactly what you need. And I also want to say, I believe that organizations now, of course, we have to look at the legal structure, but I actually think there are great inventions, if only we would use it for a better use. But I think these are probably one of the best inventions we've ever came across. So there is also huge potential there, and that's where we're also trying to go, of course.
And let me just sort of wrap it up with this journey for everybody, and it'll be a segue to Carolyn's question. I personally started this journey, and I didn't have the same courage perhaps as Otti and Antoinette. So I did a soft step. I was a director in a high-tech organization, and I knew I wasn't happy, but I didn't know what to do. So I simply said, I'm going to find some course or some program and just sign myself up, and it'll change my perspective. And that started to shake my world. And so to Carolyn's question, which is, she's asking very quickly, might you be able to suggest a PhD program or some other program? She's thinking organizational psychology, that people could perhaps sign themselves up so that they could start to, let's say, pull themselves out of this jail that is the mindset that we grow into in organizations.
Well, that's of course a very difficult question, because we're coming from Europe, and that some of you are in Europe, but we have traditionally not PhD programs, but you have to just choose well your supervisor. And I probably could tell you some people where I believe you have a chance to do that, but it's much more personalized in our.
Understood.
Maybe I would say something, and I'm very cheeky now. Go to university and not to a business school. Because I really believe, I was in both, I was working in both, but you have more freedom and you are better exposed to different kind of thinking outside the business school. So for that type of topic, there are nice management departments in universities. Go there, better chances, see what the people are writing about, get a feeling how they are, because I think you quickly realize whether these are the old kind of professors who wouldn't let you do, who wouldn't let you flourish, and then you will find something, hopefully.
Thank you. And I'm going to just stress that for everybody on the call and anyone who listens to the recording. If you are at all thinking you should do something different, but you don't know where to start, listen to Antoinette, start looking at programs in universities, not business schools, and sign yourself up for something and see what happens. You have no idea what's going to happen until you just try. And then all of a sudden it starts to build. And that's been my journey, frankly, from that one little step and 3-day course on negotiation. And away I went, and here I am. So try, take action, move yourself forward, you will learn. Otti, do you have some, perhaps some final comments, some final things you'd like to share with everybody?
Just said, be virtuous. And I mean it, right? So we can, I don't know in how many of these sessions I've sat during the last 2 years, right? Lots of well-meaning people having good conversations, but frankly, the world hasn't changed, right? So I think, let's not feel too comfortable each other, and relish in the intellectual, as Manfred Kitz-de-Vries sometimes calls it, like the intellectual masturbation. Right, we need to drive change, right? Philosophy is not there to interpret the world only, it's there to change it. So I would suggest, I mean, to Phil's point, right? If you do one thing, create that connection. Create after this call, create a new connection, right? And create the space for these type of questions. If we don't have the answers, right? I think the question is more important than the answer. So go out there, create new connections, hold the space for this development. I think, Antoinette, we were fast on the question as to how our journey has been. Let's also be honest, this journey isn't easy, right? Virtue, someone suggested, is what is difficult for us. But you need to hang in there. Simon Western on this call, Simon always says, stay with the trouble. If you want to become a good leader, if you want to become a good adult, you have to learn to stay with the trouble, right? And do it together with someone, with a few people, join the movements, as Phil is saying. And yeah, let's make this world a little different. It's hard, but it's also not too difficult, right? It starts with that single step, going out there and saying, I care. This is my world.
Antoinette, some final words for the people on the call. What should they take away? What should they do next?
Courage. Because, I mean, if you are an HR professional, you can actually change quite a lot. And I know it's hard, because they always say, what are you here for? But on the other hand, that also has some opportunities in it, because maybe you're not flying so strongly that they're seeing all the time what you're doing. So be a little bit subversive and try things out where you can, and be courageous. That's what I would say.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Otti, Antoinette. Thank you, everybody on the call listening to all of this. Thank you for your time, everybody. So I just want to remind everybody, we're going to send you a follow-up email. You're going to get a link to the recording. You're going to get the saved chat. And of course, please share this with others. This is going to be made publicly available on a YouTube or a Vimeo, somewhere like that. It would be wonderful if we could have more people get this chance to listen to this and you know, slowly shift their thinking. And of course, Antoinette and Otti will send you a follow-up so that you can reply to them directly and continue engaging with them and engaging with good organizations and this broader mission and vision that they're all on. Finally, I want to tell everybody, have a great holidays, enjoy yourselves, take as much time off as you possibly can to be with your family, with your friends, with yourself, whatever is best for you. And when you come back, we have more free public Coaching Ourselves sessions. Our next one is on January 20th. And we have Professor Jonathan Gosling with Miriam Gosling-Gage, who will be joining us for their latest Coaching Ourselves module called Inquiry into Organizational Role. It is a wonderful introspective journey into this idea that many of us, when we go to work in the morning, we're kind of like actors. And, you know, I'm going to act like the vice president and you're going to act like the director. And we go through our days acting these roles. And so this module and this discussion will give you a chance to expose that thinking with others and think that through and figure out how you can make something of all of that. Thank you, everybody. Have a great holidays, and I'll see you all in the new year. Bye, everybody. Take care, everybody. Thanks for all the great insights on the chat, by the way. That was absolutely brilliant, all that talking back and forth. Bye, everybody. Take care. All right, so we're going to stop the webinar, and that was great. I'm gonna pause the recording, and just a second here. Where's my stop button? End. All right. Oh, I have to save the chat before I do this, otherwise we know what happens. All right. Sorry about that, everybody. Bye, everybody.